Charlie, when I've followed ESP over the years, I always want to know how possibly could it work. So, look, we've talked in 2007, more than 13 years ago. I've read your books. Uh, and what more can we say about the mechanism of how it works? And look at the four big categories: telepathy, mind to mind, clairvoyance, knowing what's happening with inanimate objects at some distance, precognition, the hard one, looking to the future, psychokinesis, mind over matter. These are such attacks against the normal way the physical world works. How possibly could these things happen?
Well, I'm going to start with the hardest one first, and that's precognition.
Right.
When I look at the ESP experiments, where basically they say, in the future, some randomization process is going to scramble some targets, but would you please write down now what the order of those targets will be? It works as well as real-time ESP experiments usually. When I look at those results, I have a very difficult time because I say, look, the methodology is perfect. There's no doubt they're getting an effect. And I guess it means that information is coming from the future. And one part of my mind goes, huh? Information from the future? That makes no sense at all to me. And yet the funny thing now is that a number of these parapsychologists who have been trained as physicists think actually precognition may be the most basic form of ESP, and they use it to explain away other kinds of things. So, for instance, clairvoyance, knowing about the physical state of things that are shielded from you. When you think about that, you think somehow information from that distant place is crossing space, going through barriers into your mind, your brain, and somehow these people say, no, what quantum physics says, you couldn't have that sort of thing or something. But they say quantum physics allows for information coming back from the future. So if you correctly get some good clairvoyance results, it was some unconscious part of your mind listening to the feedback you get later on when the experimenter says, this is what the order was, and you're talking about it now. And I think, what? I can't understand precognition at all. And now it's a more basic thing. I just accept the fact that I'm puzzled on that. As far as telepathy, originally people were very excited with the discovery of brain waves because they thought, oh, there's electrical activity in the brain. It must be some kind of mental radio. Well, I was a radio engineer before I got into these other things. I know what it does to send information by radio waves. You simply don't have this strong enough transmitter to do it, much less the mechanisms. It doesn't show any of the qualities you would expect if it was electromagnetic radiation like radio. Clairvoyance, what sends the information? So, if somebody's looking at a deck of cards and they're off in another room, you can think their mind is somehow saying, this is an ace, send it. This is a king, send it, something like that. But suppose it's a clairvoyance experiment. The deck of cards has been shuffled very thoroughly and put back in the box. Nobody knows what the order is, and you're asked to write down the order, and you do significantly well. Well, it's just patterns of ink on pieces of cardboard. What's the mechanism for sending it out? I don't know. It'll call for a huge expansion of physics, probably when we get an explanation that's really useful for clairvoyance and telepathy or precognition. Or, as you pointed out, when you introduce this sort of thing, it may mean a quite different kind of science is needed to make sense of this. I still accept the idea that there will be a science in the sense that will understand causal factors that determine whether something happens or not, what its qualities are, and so forth. And it's worth our while to investigate those. I could be wrong, but in science, you find out by whether or not you actually get results, not by deciding ahead of time what you can and can't get.
The experimental data, as even the week, that excited me and impressed me literally as a teenager, which got me in so interested in the whole area, was that at whatever level the statistical significance was, and that's a separate conversation, but whatever it was no different in telepathy dependent upon the distance. So if the distance were literally shielded sitting across the table or across the city, that the statistical results would be the same. And as you said, and in a precognition experiment, it would also be the same. So if you look at any of these, the level of statistical significance is at the same level. Now, to me, maybe simplistically, I see only two possible explanations for this. Number one, you won't like the number one, is that the statistical significance is an aberration and there's really no effect whatsoever. The second is that the mechanism involved, and I'm not going to use the word physics because it potentially would be beyond physics, but the mechanisms involved is of a totally different character than anything else we're used to.
I like number two.
Yeah, I don't know number two.
I've heard the hypothesis that our statistics are not really valid. If that's true, then dozens of other sciences are going to fall by the wayside because they use the same basic analysis techniques.
Yeah, and you know, that's not an impossibility. There's been, you know, a lot of studies recently that shows 40% of psychology, peer-reviewed psychology work is non-repeatable. So, I mean, there are complexities here.
Yes.
But to follow you on number two, because, you know, I hope number two is correct. I mean, I like this stuff. I hope it's real, but I'm not going to fool myself. And I know you've used that phrase yourself. I mean, that's one thing. Maybe you know, I've used it a lot. Maybe I learned it from you. I don't remember, but I know you've said that, and I like that. But I look at one of the biggest mysteries in fundamental physics is the vast differential between the power of gravity and the power of electromagnetism. So I forgot what that is. Like 10 to the 40th difference in power. And one of the theories is, just one, is that the reason is that gravity is sort of leaking through multi-dimensional space in some way. Now, this has nothing to do with ESP or anything. That's pure ways to understand this vast difference in order of magnitudes between two of the most fundamental things in physics. So to explain that big of a difference, they're struggling to find some radically new mechanism, and they come up with multiple dimensions beyond the four that we know, and ways of doing that. Not been proven, of course, but that's a way of thinking. So my second hypothesis would be that if it's real and you have no differentiation between space and time, because precognition is effect over time, and clairvoyance or telepathy is effect over space. So basically we're saying ESP, if it's real to the degree that it's real, it's operating independent of space and time.
Let's make that even more complicated, because any precognition experiment is both a space and a time separation experiment, because the Earth is moved several thousand miles by the time the information is created in the future. Yeah. I'll add a third hypothesis here, that this is going to call for a state-specific science to really make a difference in the end. And you probably know about my paper on the creation of state-specific sciences back in 1970, something like that. In altered states of consciousness, such as might be produced by meditation, psychedelic drugs, or things like that, sometimes there are totally different ways of thinking. So my hope is that a state-specific science will make sense of this someday, make sense of it, and by which I mean not only will it be understandable to at least the people trained in going into that particular altered state, but they'll then be able to actually manipulate the effect and prove that they have some control over it. You know, like some people say, I've got a better radio system and I can prove it because you can hear me on the other side of the earth instead of just a block down the street or something like that.
So go ahead.
I was told that Einstein, for instance, was very much a tactile kind of thinker. He had some imagery that was about how things felt. And he apparently did a lot of his creative thinking that way. He had to turn it back into mathematics at the end to publish it for other people because we're not trained in how to communicate tactually, that sort of thing. But he may have been working in a different kind of state of consciousness that way. I've had indications from a number of scientists in various other fields that when they're actually working in a discovery kind of way, their mind works in an entirely different way from normal. But they can't say that when they actually publish their paper. They've got to go through the proper forms and make it reasonable sounding and logical and so forth. And they can produce results from it. That may be what gets developed, but that's a hope on the future. I don't know whether that'll work now or not.
If it's the case that the ESP is real to some degree, if it's real to some degree, it's real and it needs to be explained, and it is independent of space and time, as we've said, whether it's precognition or any clairvoyance, telepathy, um, it, it, and we start searching for new ways of measuring things. Is the work that you've done and pioneered in altered states of consciousness, whether it's meditation or psychedelics or sleep or other different kinds of altered states, does that have, could there be some nexus between the two? And if there is, do you see enhancement of ESP phenomena in altered states?
I hope so. I'm not going to make that big a deal out of my work in altered states. It's not like I've discovered all sorts of things so much as what I've been able to do has been able to show that it's reasonable to study altered states and begin finding out things. But I don't think we know very much yet. But I think that may indeed make a difference. I'm waiting for a good example to pop into my head. Okay, here's an interesting example. It's not quite there. I was giving a lecture on altered states of and on my altered states of consciousness class at UC Davis once, and I was talking about dreams. And I made a point that dreams are not just sort of random imagery. And I thought, that's a kind of abstract statement. How can I give an example of that? And I sort of, I need an example. And so I said, oh, it's not like you dream about a gorilla, a Volkswagen, and an ice cream cone. There's a plot to things, they go together. And I went on with my lecture. And at the end of the lecture, a young woman came up to me and said quite indignantly, where did you get that example from? I just made it up. She said, well, I used to have this recurring dream about how we'd been out to get some ice cream, and then this gorilla was coming down the street, and I was hiding in our Volkswagen, and we didn't even own a Volkswagen. I said, oh. For a moment, my mind was in some kind of different mode, okay? I couldn't prove this was ESP or make that claim or a particular, it was all too fast, but something allowed parts of the mind to work that don't normally work that way. A lot of creativity works that way. They don't teach you how to be creative when you study a science. They assume it happens. It might work a lot better if they taught you to go into altered states and see things from a quite different perspective.
The alternative explanation for that very striking example is that there are hundreds of trillions of examples like that that did not occur. And when one does occur, it affects you emotionally, and well should. But if you understood that in the context of the hundreds and trillions, and that's a small number compared to what it really is, all the different possibilities that did not occur, it would just be a random event.
Sounds like an excellent psychological defense mechanism to not have to deal with certain kinds of data. I had enough clinical psychology to know that we defend our beliefs and our attitudes very, very effectively.
You've done some work in studying in out of the body experiments, OBE.
Yeah.
What can you how does that affect the entire field? What can we learn from that?
Well, I got interested in out of the body experiences from coming across a book by a guy who was a young man at the time, and he started having them spontaneously. This was back in the 1930s, I think, something like that. And I liked his attitude. He said, you know, you'll think I'm nuts when I describe how my mind went out of my body and I went different places and did different things and all that. And I understand it's a perfectly nutty idea, but this is what happened to me. And here in this book, I'm going to tell you as carefully and as accurately as I can what happened and what were some of the things that seemed to affect so that I would have an out of the body experience. So for instance, he said, he came up with a basic rule that if you really, really, really want to go somewhere and your body is so relaxed it can't respond, like in really deep sleep, you may leave your body. And said, if you want to try it, have nothing to drink all day and have a nice glass of warm salt water before bedtime. And you might wake up in the middle of the night finding yourself trying to turn on the sink, but your body's back in bed. Yeah. But the important thing about out of the body experiences is that people who have them usually end up saying something like, I don't believe that I'm going to survive death. I know I'm going to survive death. I've been out of my body and my mind was still me. It was working fine and so forth. I don't care about your arguments and so forth. Well, that's a tremendous conviction to have. That changes the way people live their lives. Is that just a delusion? Could be. I mean, from the outside, you can say, yeah, you're crazy. But for people who have it, that's almost always the kind of thing they can include. Knowledge of out of the body experience was pretty rare, usually from people who just had personal experience. But what I was able to do was bring this woman into the laboratory and show that this really exotic, strange thing could happen under laboratory conditions. And I could measure her brainwaves. I found out she showed an unusual brainwave pattern. I showed this particular brainwave tracing to one of the leading world experts on sleep EEGs. We both agreed. That's weird. Never saw anything like that. It contains a suggestion of activity that might promote out of the body experiences. I don't know. But also, to get at the ESP part of it, I did have a number up on a shelf near the ceiling. So if she floated up near the ceiling, she'd be able to read the number, but it wasn't readable from in the room. On only one occasion did she say she got in the right position up near the ceiling to see it. And she correctly said, that's 25132. I think that's 100,000 to 1 odds. Not bad. I do not claim that was proof of ESP. That was one experiment, but it shows you can test this sort of thing. And so here's something that convinces people they're going to survive death. Wouldn't it be nice to have more factual information about what goes on?
And when you have one example, there could be all sorts of trickery. You know, you could have been sleeping, she could have stood up, or who knows what, or had some mirror.
People, when I have talked about this in lecture, somebody invariably says, did you know the target number? And when I say yes, they say, she didn't leave her body, it was just telepathy. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think the control for mere telepathy. Really me.
Right. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.